Welcome to Short Story Boudoir. I'm Katy Gathright.
And I'm Samantha Neugebauer.
And this is our show where we talk about one short story a month because you always want to be able to talk about the stories you're reading, and sometimes it's hard to find that person, so we're going to dive in again.
And we have our sweets with us as we had the last time that we met.
We do. These cupcakes are just gracing the bottom of the screen.
Exactly. We'll probably eat them afterwards because it's a little tough to be filmed while eating and talking, but we will eat them. So
yes, we will.
Today we're talking about Jhumpa Lahiri's The Third and Final Continent. This is a story that was published in her collection, The Interpretive Maladies, in 1999.
Yeah, I think this is actually the first short story collection I read through cover to cover.
Forever.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
In high school. I was just thinking about that after you mentioned that the other day.
Oh, that's awesome. That's really interesting. I came to the story later. Only a few years ago. I read it for the first time. But that's the perfect time to say that we will be sharing spoilers in a moment. So if you have not read the story, pause the video now and go read the story.
I think it matters in this case.
It definitely matters, absolutely. Okay, so I'm gonna tell a little bit about the pacing, the plot of this story. This story is an immigrant story. It's the story of a man who goes from India to England to the United States, and it's a story of kind of the people he meets along the way and his housing actually in all of these places. And mostly what's interesting about this story is that it's an entire life. So by the end of this narrative, it starts in 1964 when our protagonist is a young man in his early 30s, I believe. Yes, and then it ends when he is a father with a son at college. So it's a retrospective story, and along the way we meet different kind of characters and figures. Most of the story takes place in America, where he is working as a researcher at MIT. And he takes a room in a house of a very old woman, a woman who is over 100 years old, a widow, and he lives with her for a little under 6 weeks, I think. And how that relationship affects his life overall, how he sees the world, how he sees America, and ultimately how it affects his relationship with his new wife, who between the time he moved to England and America, and I really mean between the time, we're talking a week or so, he goes back to England, marries a woman whose brother and his sister-in-law had recommended, and leaves her for America. So he doesn't know this woman very well, but Mrs. Croft, who is the elderly woman that he ends up living with, somehow plays a small but important role in their marriage.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great recap, and I think one of the things I was interested in was, Mrs. Croft, obviously, because she's probably the second main character after this first person narrator. But I'm also interested in Helen, who's her daughter, who shows up, Mala, the wife, the name of the wife who does come into the story eventually, and then the son too. So we do have our main protagonist, but then also these sort of secondary characters, and I do feel like even though the story is largely in the head of our protagonist and really him narrating his whole life, as you say, all the characters feel around to me. Like, I do feel like the story does a really good job of making the space count for each character. So I feel like I know Mrs. Croft, and I feel like I know Helen, her daughter, who really, again, could easily not be in this story.
Absolutely, yeah. She visits sometimes. While our narrator, who goes unnamed, I think, right?
Yes.
While our narrator is living with Mrs. Croft.
Yeah.
And she's older too.
Yeah.
She's in her 60s.
Yeah,
so.
she is. Yeah, Helen is in her 60s. Her mom is 103. But there's that moment in the story where Helen is walking down the stairs, I think, because Mrs. Croft yells out for help, and the narrator is with Helen, and they have to kind of go down the stairs to help this old woman. And it's just, there's a detail about how Helen like has like a knee issue or something, and so she's like walking very slowly and having kind of trouble going down the stairs. And I just felt like that alone told me a lot for some reason. I think that, again, Helen doesn't really even need to be here for plot reasons, but somehow knowing that Mrs. Croft has also raised a daughter who is now an aging woman herself ends up feeling relevant to me.
Right, and there's this interesting thing happening where time and space are sort of being plotted on like planes of three as well, right? So we have India, England, America, and we have like Mala and our narrator, Helen, and then like Mrs. Croft. And I think that's really interesting because I think one of the reasons that these characters stand out so much to me as like fully formed people is that their generational differences seem to shine through.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I really felt that at the end too with the son who...
Oh, right. And another generation.
Yeah, of course. And the son was sort of like most amazed by the like price differences in the past versus the future. And I love just like, we're with the son for maybe 2 paragraphs at the end. And the son, you know, again, could kind of easily sort of not be in this story, but just giving the son that detail of like, wow, I can't believe it only cost you $8 a week to live somewhere. Made me feel like, oh yeah, I know this young man. I kind of was this young man. Like that's the kind of thing that I would be amazed by too.
I was too. At one point, we're told early on what he's paying for his boarding room at the YMCA, and it is like that. And I was like, wow, that's cheap, like, note that. And then at the end when the son says that, I was like, oh, that's wonderful.
I know. And it's like Lahiri planted that detail knowing that we would react like the son would.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then I love too, like, the fact of depositing the money on the piano. Again, it's such a logistical detail that's in this story. It's kind of how he first connects with Mrs. Croft, and I'm so glad it's in there because I just feel like I learn a lot about Mrs. Croft by like these logistical details, like where she likes to sit, where she likes the money to be put, that kind of thing.
Absolutely, and there's such a difference in a person then who has lived in one place for a very long time and who sort of has control over her space, and someone like our narrator who is so mobile, and his space is so shared. So in the story, you know, I said we start in 1964, where our protagonist has just received some kind of certificate and moves to England, I think to go to school more, right?
Yeah.
And he's living with a bunch of other men, right? And as you do, right, when you're in grad school or whatnot. And, you know, they're eating cheaply and there's all these extraordinary details. You know, they're meeting people and bringing them over. They're playing games. It sounds kind of messy sometimes. But none of these men, who are more like him, right, because they're all from the same country for the most part, I think, and, you know, have a lot of the same kind of cultural touchstones, are designated with names. Like, we don't get to know any of them. It's sort of like they're this floating mass in the character's memory. And what's interesting to me to that, in that extent, is that it seems like they were too much like him in a way, and then he identified so much with them, and there was so much comfort in that. But then when he moved to another place and he met this person from this much different generation, the impression was so much larger.
That makes a lot of sense. And really, you know, I think we're both interested in how this story works from a craft level, and I think, you know, you could start the story in Boston. You could start it, you know, at like when he arrives, goes to MIT. You could skip the second continent of England.
Definitely.
But there is something really nice about seeing the contrast of what it's like to live with these other young men and then move into a world where, there's a lot of differentiation, and that comes from like him figuring out how to be, how he's going to be for the rest of his life.
Right. And I think it's pushing against a kind of narrative where we all have like one big trip in our life. Like there's one moment of mobility, whether it's very physical or through capital or through something that happens in your life, and like saying that we might have multiple moments of mobility through our life, but you know, some are going to be more than others. Like
there's not really an attempt to make all things equal, right? Like, yeah, life is sort of a little bit stop-start. England happens. It's maybe not the most formative, but you can imagine like a different version or like a novel length that would actually go back and say like these things happened there that mattered a lot too. But like I think the story isn't interested in forcing like this is the important thing that happened in England and like this is the important thing that happened in Massachusetts.
Definitely. Absolutely. And I think that that leads me to what I really want to talk about, which was the narrative voice in this piece and a little bit about that narrative pacing that goes along with that. There's a sense when this story starts that you're actually entering novel mode for me in a way. Maybe I'll just read the first couple lines. Okay. I left India in 1964 with a certificate in commerce and the equivalent in those days of $10 to my name. For 3 weeks, I sat on the SS Roma, an Italian cargo vessel, in a cabin next to the ship's engine, across the Arabian Sea, the Red Sea, the Mediterranean, and finally to England. I lived in London, in Finsbury Park, in a house occupied entirely by penniless Bengali bachelors like myself, at least a dozen, and sometimes more, all struggling to educate and establish ourselves abroad.
It does feel like a novel opening.
It does, right? It feels Dickens almost. It's so grand.
Yeah, it's so grand. We're moving across time and space, really. And it's summary, too, which I think is interesting. We're not, like, jumping into a specific scene. But yeah, to your, like, interest in how we're endeared to the narrator, I feel like there's so much happening there, and obviously this journey would be scary and formative and taxing for anyone, but I'm struck by how like there's no emotion is told in that opening.
Right, absolutely.
And I think that helps in a way.
I think it helps in a way too because we know it's a retrospective story, we get the sense that whatever emotions were there, maybe the present day narrator maybe doesn't disagrees with maybe a little bit or something. Like he doesn't want to overemphasize maybe like some of the shocks he felt or some of the cultural shocks he felt. Which is neat in a way.
No, I hadn't thought about it that way, how that relates to the retrospective narrator, but it's true. It's almost like he is wary of sensationalizing his own story, and that is an endearing quality.
Absolutely. And there's something to the voice too that feels like we have all the time in the world, which is absolutely not how I feel most of the time, and I would like to feel that way more of the time. And he talks about, I mean, this is in the third paragraph, so we're going to America already by the third paragraph, about how he gets the student guidebook to North America. Although I was no longer a student, I was on a budget all the same, and he learns things like Americans drove on the right side of the road, and we call a lift an elevator. And this also, I think, contributes to the slowness of it. Like, what a different time. Like, how to kind of discover facts of a new place, like having to go to the store and getting this book.
Yeah, it's all very, like, tactile. And I think, it establishes a different pace than I think a lot of other short stories do. And I think for that reason, something I've been curious to ask you is like, how did you feel when you were reading this story from a pacing perspective? Like, were you itchy? Were you like wondering what was going to happen? Were you like anticipating a big climax? What were you reading for?
That's such an interesting question, because I know that I've read this story a couple times, as I think you have too. And certainly on my first read, like I just wanted to know like what was going to happen to this character. And I think that a lot of stories that I've studied or read on my own have set me up for like, the grand moment or the moment of change. And I kept feeling like we were entering these moments that could be that moment. And then they weren't. Right. Like he has this arranged marriage and it goes unmentioned for like paragraphs. Like it's wild, actually.
He mentions the wedding kind of in passing, and then even when he arrives. And
and then when he gets to Boston, like I said, he stays in a YMCA, and then he moves into Mrs. Croft's house, and you're like, when is this moment of change? And I think that I kept waiting for that, but just also at the same time, just delighting in the accumulation of his experiences, which I feel like was part of almost the lesson of the story, that like you keep waiting for these moments of change, and then maybe like sometimes when they come, and I mean this is making it sound like a Aesop's fable or something, it's not at all, but when a change does come, it's sometimes like a lot less smaller than you expect.
Yeah, it takes time to register too. Yeah. Like I'm not sure that he, in real time, or like in the time when the story's taking place, when he's living with Mrs. Croft, I don't think we get the sense that he knew then that it was like going to be this very formative thing.
No, I think he was unhappy with like the window that he was looking at, right? In his like, kind of grad student accommodations. Yeah. And this seemed like a good deal.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, so my question for you is about when Mila comes to the U.S.
Yeah.
And so maybe you could tell us a little bit about that, and then eventually our narrator takes Mila to meet Mrs. Croft. And Mrs. Croft sort of looks, her up and down. And my heart was clenched a minute, like, what is she going to say to her? And she ultimately says that Mila is a perfect lady. And that just had such meaning to me in that moment. Like, it was just so beautiful. I was so happy for her approval, and also like, is this weird that I wanted this old lady's approval for this young couple? This young, like, couple that is not from the U.S. Like, how did you feel about that scene and kind of Mala maybe in general?
Yeah, no, I felt the same way. Like, I was really delighted by that moment too. I have all the same curiosities about my emotional reaction to that also. But I don't know, I think we read for complication and we read for reversal a lot of the time. And I think Mrs. Croft is a character who, just by virtue of being, born in the 19th century, she's like this literally 100-year-old white woman in the 1960s. And you expect racism. And I don't even think that the story is saying that she's never had a racist moment either. No. But I think it's really like pleasing when she has a reaction we wouldn't necessarily slot for her from the very beginning. And it's weird, she's a woman who like orders him to say splendid, which is a weird thing. It's not even like Mrs. Croft is entirely like warm and like beyond reproach. Like she has her weird quirks, and I love that she is weird and that she's able to just like love Mala instantly.
Me too.
And in terms of your question about Mala as a character, like I think I felt really close to her in that scene. Like I would also feel so like, who is this random person I'm meeting? Where am I? Like, what is the relationship between Mrs. Croft and my new husband? How do I act? And just trying to be like kind and prim. And I don't know, I really identified with that. Like just the like shyness and the forcing yourself to just go with something. So yeah, I feel like Mala could easily have been kind of a prop in this story, but I really felt for her in that scene. And that made a big difference to me.
Yeah, and I think what's important to note about that scene is after kind of Mrs. Croft gives her, words of approval, we see Mala and our protagonist lock eyes and smile together for the first time, and that feels like this pivot in the book, or at least in the way the narrator is telling his story. Like Mala might have felt that pivot actually at a different moment. And I love that too.
Yeah, totally. It's almost like, the story starts and you're like, okay, this is going to maybe be a story about a marriage, but then it's not for a very long time. And then you realize like he was coming around to it,
and it becomes very much, I think, a story actually about like duty and responsibility. He is obviously kind of making his way in the world because of the opportunities that his family wants him to have, and different things that, go on in the family back home. And Mala has made her way in this world also because her husband has made this choice for her. And Mrs. Croft is taking on, young men, as she says again and again, like only from Tech or Harvard, kind of a little bit of some comedy. And because she's a widow, right? She can no longer give piano lessons, like she has arthritis now. So everyone has these duties, and like what I think shines through in that moment for me too is like the way that and somehow like across these cultural differences and generational differences, like almost like a type of class, but I don't mean class in like the sense of like pecuniary concerns or anything. I mean class in the sense of like people who are respectful of other people and who are dutiful and kind. That shows through. Like it's like seeing like.
Yes, yes, and I love that the story. Like, it's a sort of a subtle point for a story to make, and I think it works here.
Absolutely,
it does shine through. Gosh, there's so much to talk about, but I guess we should talk about our favorite lines.
Right, I think so.
Okay. So I really forced myself to not pick the ending, which I'll say I really do love the ending of the story, and a lot of my favorite lines are there, but I feel like left to my own devices, I will do that for so many stories. So I chose a line from earlier when he's staying at the YMCA before he moves to Mrs. Croft's. And the narrator tells us, I ate cornflakes and milk morning and night and bought some bananas for variety, slicing them into the bowl with the edge of my spoon. I left my carton of milk on the shaded part of the windowsill, as I had seen other residents at the YMCA do. And I really like this because this is not a narrator who's flashy with language or figurative language or metaphor, but I feel like there are these moments that are just a little bit more poetic than they have to be. And it comes through with like these practical choices of like, I just love thinking about the shaded part of the windowsill as like the cooler place to put milk if you don't have a fridge. So
yeah, I agree, and sometimes it can be hard to make brand names sound poetic, but somehow like Lahiri is able to do that.
I know,
which is really wonderful.
It is great.
Okay, so my favorite line comes to us after the narrator finds out the age of Mrs. Croft, which, you know, he had guessed she was like in her 70s or something, and then he learns from the daughter Helen that she is over 100 years old. He says, at times I tried to picture the world she had been born into. In 1880, a world I imagined filled with women in long black skirts and chaste conversations in the parlor. And what I love about this is how I think, you know, we're kind of late to being humans in a way it can feel sometimes. And or at least to recorded history in a way, and it's probably a silly statement, or at least future people will think that's a silly statement, but it can feel that way sometimes, and all we really get are like these tiny impressions of people from different times and places. And I love that our narrator just like lays it out. Like, these are the 2 inches that pop into my mind when I hear this time period. I'm not pretending to know more or less. This is like a very honest snapshot, and I think that is something that a lot of us, unless we know, you know, deeply about another place, that's all we get to have.
Yeah, it's so relatable, and another reason why I think this narrator is appealing. I think he's very honest.
Absolutely,
you know, it goes a long way.
Okay, so this was our discussion of the third and final continent. I think we could have spoken probably for much longer. There were lots of things we didn't get a chance to talk about.
But you can put them in the comments if you have ideas.
And we will see you next month for our next episode.
Awesome.
Ciao.
Thanks. See
Bye.
ya.